How's it going, guys? Riv here. Hoping you're all doing well in this time of quarantine. Hope you're okay. Hope you're keeping busy. I, for one, have found solace in ranking the Strokes albums, which I'm about to share my definitive ranking of with you. Now, if you're listening to this, I probably don't need to tell you, but these are the guys you have to thank for much of the post-punk, much of the garage rock that came out in the 2000s, because these are essentially the guys that breathed new life into the genre back in 2001. So needless to say, I think very highly of these guys. They're one of my favorite bands, and so rest assured, I put a lot of thought into this ranking. I even allowed the New Abnormal to digest for like a month or so, which it has. And with all that being said, let's just get into the sixth placement on this ranking, which is Angles. And before talking about why Angles is where it is, let's talk about what you're looking at. So, staying true to the channel name, I decided to rate every song out of 10 on the album, and then I averaged those ratings into an overall album rating. Now, keep in mind, this is not always the best way to rate an album, because it doesn't really account for how the songs work together as a cohesive whole. But in the case of The Strokes, it sort of seemed to work out that the album ratings reflected really what I was thinking in terms of my ranking anyway. And just in case you don't feel like reading every rating, I went ahead and I highlighted anything that's a 9 or higher in green and anything that's particularly low in red. And with that out of the way, I want to direct your attention to the album rating of Angles. Not so I can make some juvenile pun, but to show you that even the weakest Strokes album is essentially a 7 out of 10. And that's because Angles has some of the band's strongest hooks, some of their catchiest songs. Under the Cover of Darkness and Taken for a Fool are top tier Strokes songs for sure. But there's another side to this album that sort of just feels like half-hearted attempts at experimentation. And I respect the band for trying new things, but for some reason or another, these more experimental songs just don't quite grab me. Either their production isn't landing, or Julian just seems a bit sleepy on the vocals. And with all that in mind, Angles sort of ends up being a pretty mixed bag, in my opinion. And so moving on to the fifth place, we have First Impressions of Earth, which is notable for a few things. One, it features Julian's most potent lyricism, in my opinion. He gets dark on this album, he gets existential at times, and the guitar work is equally heavy in tone. And when that sound clicks, it clicks, the case in point being Eyes of the World. However, I will say this album suffers from being a bit too bloated. The middle leg gets sort of caught up in this dreary mid-tempo drag, and I think if you just cut back a few of those tracks, you would have something much tighter that would probably move up a place on my ranking. But speaking of the next place, we have Come Down Machine. Now let me start by saying that this is easily the Strokes' most underrated album. I have no idea why this album gets so severely overlooked. To some extent, I understand. Is the production amazing? Absolutely not. Is it a little all over the place? Yes. But this is an undeniably fun album. They try out so many different sounds on this album, and it clicks for the most part. I don't understand how anyone can listen to Julian's falsetto and not have a good time. I don't understand how you listen to the stadium chorus of Happy Ending and not feel good about yourself. And all of the 80s influences sprinkled throughout this thing, they put a smile on my face. And then there's Call It Fate, Call It Karma, a beautiful album closer. I don't get it. In fact, I think this album's at its worst when it's trying to sound like classic Strokes. Just look at All the Time and 50-50. I mean, for the most part, this album, it's fun, it's colorful, it's Come Down Machine. And at number 3, we have the newest addition to the Strokes catalog, the New Abnormal, which successfully bridges the gap between Julian's more experimental side with the voids and his solo stuff, and the more bittersweet classic sound of the early Strokes. And because of that, you have an album that really anyone can enjoy, regardless of whether you're more of a purist or you're more into the new experimental stuff that Julian has been doing. And on top of all of that, you have the sounds of 80s post-punk all over this thing, and I really think it blends nicely into the core sound of the Strokes. And also worth noting, this is probably the best Julian Casablancas has sounded on anything. The Adults Are Talking and Eternal Summer just being a couple instances of how great this guy's range has become. And when you weigh in Rick Rubin's production style, I think you get something that is overall unique and intimate while still being pretty familiar to Strokes fans. I think that's why it slid so easily into the third spot here. Okay, and now here's where it gets complicated. You see, the back catalog of the Strokes you can kind of throw around and rearrange how you want and justify it. This is where it gets tough, alright? Because here's a hot take incoming. At number 2, we have Is This It? Now, keep in mind that number 2 is no insult when it comes to the Strokes albums, because this is an excellent album that the music industry owes a lot to. Some of my favorite albums that fall under that garage rock umbrella would not exist without this album coming first, and I think it's pretty easy to understand the appeal. I mean, it sounds so effortless and so carefree, but is still so well put together and complex. And Julian's lo-fi croon combined with his lyricism, it just feels like the bittersweet sentiments of someone in their 20s trying to figure stuff out. And it really just it hits home in a lot of ways. Not to mention that this album is just filled with hooks, like hooks left and right. And the guitar work and the melodies just work so well with one another. It really is just a great album. And this is one of those instances where my album rating system does not work, because this is something that should really be in the 9 range when you consider how the songs work well as a cohesive whole. Now, if we were to take into account impact on the music industry and context, then yeah, Is This It takes the cake. But if we were to put these albums into a vacuum, outside of context, outside of industry, and you just had to go off of music alone, then I have to give the slight edge to Room on Fire. And really, if you wanted most of my reasoning, you could just go back and listen to what I said about Is This It. It really does scratch a lot of the same itches, but I think it adds to it. I think the production is a little crisper. Nick and Albert get a little more intricate with their guitar work, the guitar tones they use, the flourishes. I also think they sharpen their songwriting abilities on this album, going from double choruses on Reptilia to absolute slow jams like Under Control. And so yeah, overall, I think they take something that's already so well executed on Is This It, and they just build upon it ever so slightly to make for an album that will never not be one of my favorites. And so that concludes my ranking of the Strokes albums. I know there were a few hot takes along the way, but hopefully I was clear enough that you can understand my reasoning, even if you didn't really agree with me. And feel free to rank the albums in the comments, or if you have any questions about why I rated a song a certain way, leave those as well. I'm happy to know what you guys think. And I know at some point in the summer season, I plan to rank the Weezer albums, which will be interesting to say the least. So if that interests you, feel free to subscribe. But otherwise, that about does it.